Hallo und herzlich willkommen zum Livestream. Wir schauen auf die Notenbanker, wir schauen auf EZB-Präsidenten Lagarde und Fed-Chef Powell. Heute sind sie dabei zum Policy Panel beim EZB-Forum im Sintra. Ist ein bisschen wie Jackson Hole, Notenbanker-Treffen, ein bisschen Austausch, findet auch meistens in etwas entspannterer Atmosphäre statt. Daher nicht unbedingt jetzt hier große Schlagzeilen zu erwarten, aber die entspannte Atmosphäre, die sorgt ihm gerne mal dafür, dass vielleicht doch mal was rausrutscht. Ein bisschen was rausrutscht, man doch mal etwas Neues sagen möchte. Schauen wir uns an. Es beginnt 14:30 Uhr, 15:30 Uhr, also Ortszeit 14:30 Uhr, bei uns 15:30 Uhr geht es los und momentan ja noch Worteschleife. Wir schalten dann natürlich direkt um auf Großbild, sind wir dann dabei. Und da verpasst ihr nichts. Zuvor können wir noch ein bisschen auf den heutigen Handelstag schauen. Wir können ein bisschen auf die Indizes schauen. Es ist ja schon Bewegung drin in den Märkten. Und schauen wir gerne mal drauf. Wir gucken erstmal, wir sind ja eigentlich in der stärksten Handelswoche des Jahres, in den ersten zwei starken Handelswochen des Jahres, wie Anfang Juli, eine Auftakt in die starke Saisonalität und auch Auftakt ins Quartal mit der frischen Liquidität eigentlich fester, ne? Und viele haben ja gleich schon gesehen, oh, Blow auf Top könnte nun drohen. Also man schießt da mal richtig nach oben. So ein bisschen meine Gemengelage, ich hatte es vorgestern schon gesagt zum Stand-up-Video. Vermutlich eher volatil. Mal gucken, jetzt haben wir schon eine Schwächetendenz, fast schon zu schwach, aber wie gesagt, das schauen wir uns gleich charttechnisch nochmal an. Wir gehen nochmal ganz kurz hinein in die Termine, die wir in dieser Woche haben. Muss ich ein bisschen zurückzoomen, damit ihr das richtig sehen könnt. Beziehungsweise schauen wir einfach erstmal hier oben hin. Heute hatten sie Verbraucherpreise aus der Eurozone. Schauen wir auch gleich nochmal drauf. Jetzt kommt gleich das Panel. Wie gesagt, eher mal ein bisschen lockere Atmosphäre. Sarah Eisen von CNBC wird das moderieren. Wird vermutlich eine lockere Gesellschaftsrunde werden, aber eben vielleicht rutscht da eben was durch. Die Job-Openings werden heute auch noch gemeldet. Morgen haben wir eben den vorzeitige Schließung an der Wall Street, der Unabhängigkeitstag steht an, übermorgen ist dann Feiertag in den USA und ich hatte es eben schon in der Discord-Community geschrieben, wie gesagt, kommt gerne hinein, Link habe ich gepostet, nur noch heute gibt es die Rabattaktion, also wer Discord-Trader-Community haben möchte, klickt bitte den Link im Chat oder dann auch in der Videobeschreibung, hatte ich schon gepostet, so ein bisschen die Annahme, dass wir die Schwäche über den Feiertag dann doch nochmal hochziehen können. A, weil die Saisonalität natürlich spitze ist, aber B, weil eben die Feiertage zu gerne oder an der Mehrzahl fester sind. Ne? Nicht unbedingt jetzt 3-4% nach oben, aber eben fester. Und deswegen ein bisschen die Annahme, dass wir vielleicht doch nochmal umdrehen und dann die nächsten 2 Tage fester notieren und dann mal sehen, wie der Wochenabschluss gelingt. Der Wochenabschluss wird ja gebildet durch den, könnt ihr den sehen, den US-Arbeitsmarktbericht, der dann am Freitag veröffentlicht wird. Wird sehr wichtig sein zum Thema Konjunktur. Morgen, wie gesagt, verkürzter Handel in den USA. Wir haben die Einkaufsmanager-Indizes, die endgültigen aus Deutschland und der Eurozone. Wir haben die ATP-Beschäftigungszahlen, die bilden da so ein Gesamtbild mit den heute gemeldeten Job-Openings. Außerdem ISM, Dienstleistungssektor, der wird wichtig, wie es um die US-Konjunktur steht. Verarbeitende Gewerbe müht sich ja schon ab. Dienstleistungssektor ist aber die deutlich größere Komponente, wenn es ums BIP-Wachstum geht. Außerdem, FED-Protokoll, Donnerstag haben wir dann das EZB-Protokoll, aber das ist eigentlich Schall und Rauch. Was interessiert uns, was die vor mehreren Wochen gesagt haben, die Notenbanker, wenn sie jetzt jeden Tag mehrfach sich zu Wort melden und jetzt auch gleich wieder EZB-Präsidentin Lagarde und Fed-Chef Powell, also das ist, guckt man mal drauf, aber wird keine Marktbewegung sein. Interessant ist eben wirklich Feiertage, die gerne fester sind, da vielleicht die Chance, dass wir es doch nochmal stabilisieren können, es sei denn, Jerome Powell haut hier gleich richtig was raus. Und Freitag eben der US-Arbeitsmarktbericht, der auch ein schwächerer Bericht wird erwartet, also dass die neu geschaffenen Stellen niedriger ausfallen, dass die Eintrübe in die Konjunktur so langsam hineinsickern und wir merken ja auch, dass die Bad News nicht mehr richtig die Bad News sind. Das feiert man nicht mehr, weil dann Inflation gesenkt wird. Wir sehen es ja auch beim DAX, ne? Seitdem man eigentlich die Zinssenkung bekommen hat, fehlt irgendwie der Antrieb. Die zweite Zinssenkung, die sich andeutet, zieht nicht so richtig, die Konjunkturdaten ziehen nicht so richtig. Ja, man müht sich ein bisschen, es fehlt ein bisschen der Trigger. Wir blicken hier mal auf die heute gemeldeten Inflationsdaten. Hört eigentlich die Musik die ganze Zeit die Musik, ich muss mal ausmachen, es tut mir leid. Aber vermutlich war es auch eine schöne Untermalung. Also die Inflationsdaten, die heute gemeldet wurden, ihr seht selbst, ne? Wir sind hier unter 3% bei der Kerninflation, aber letztendlich stabil geblieben. Ne? Die Zielzone, wir waren hier lange lange Zeit zu niedrig unter dem Zielband der EZB und auch bei der FED. Aber von der 2% sind wir ja auch noch ein bisschen entfernt, aber auch nicht zu weit. Ne? Die Hochinflationsphase, die haben wir ja schon deutlich verlassen. Die erste Zinssenkung ist da und meiner Meinung nach ist die Tür für die zweite Senkung ab September auch sehr weit geöffnet, weil eben die Konjunktur sich nicht so richtig bewegt. Aber eben kann Inflation stabil. Dienstleisterinflation war auch relativ fest. Sehen wir hier nochmal, Waren. Da geht die Inflation spürbar zurück, aber Dienstleisterinflation sehr fest und auch gestern die Inflationsdaten aus Deutschland, ne, die Lebensmittelpreise, die Dienstleistungssektor hoch. Also die gefühlte Inflation, oder die reale Inflation dann eigentlich, ne, die merkt der Bürger. Und das sehen wir ja dann auch beim GfK-Konsumklima etc., wo das dann auch sich widerspiegelt und die Konsumlaune hinten nicht aufkommt. Also ja, unterschwellig so richtig gut sind die Inflationsdaten noch nicht, aber vermutlich gut genug, um eine weitere Zinssenkung zu rechtfertigen. Und mal sehen, ob was Jerome Powell meint. Die FED steht ja da noch ganz woanders. Auch wenn die Inflation wieder ihren disinflationären Trend aufgenommen hat, ist man doch noch ein gutes Stück entfernt. Haben wir noch was? Ja, Warnsignale ein bisschen im Markt. Hatten wir heute schon Market Briefing gesprochen. Was jetzt zuletzt auch ein bisschen reingesickert ist, ist ein bisschen die politische Unsicherheit. Ne? Die Anleiherenditen zuletzt wieder angestiegen, die Anleihevolatilität, die hier gemessen werden im Move-Index, auch angestiegen. Also das ist schon ein bisschen, ja, Marktbreite ist ein Thema. Natürlich haben wir Sommerhandel, Volumen geht ein bisschen zurück, die Volatilität, kleine Schwankungsbreite. Es fehlt natürlich ein bisschen der Trigger, um mal sowas aufzulösen. Aber mit den Anleiherenditen ist schon so ein Punkt, hatte ich heute, wie gesagt, im Market Briefing schon gepostet, die 10-jährige im Wochenchart, also so ganz selbstverständlich, dass wir dort einen Abwärtstrend hineinfallen. Bereits jetzt ist das alles noch nicht. Also auch die politische Börse kommt hier etwas hinzu, ohne das politische Thema immer ganz hoch zu hängen. Ihr wisst es, da bin ich etwas zurückhaltend, auch bei dem Thema Frankreich-Wahl oder Nahosten. Das haben wir ja so häufig thematisiert. Aber das sickert so langsam in den Markt und könnte eben Richtung Wahltermin auch stärker werden. Wir hatten ja, ich kann ja kurz mal schauen, die Performance aktuell, ne, die Performance für dieses Wahljahr, ne, hier rot zu sehen, ist wirklich das beste Wahljahr, was die USA aktuell gesehen haben. Und wenn man ja real schaut, in was für eine Wahl man hier hineinläuft, ne, Senil mit gegen verrückter Populist, bessere Kandidaten konnte es ja nicht geben, also muss es ja nur nach oben gehen. Ne? Also das ist schon ein bisschen kurios und es kann sein, dass hier die Unsicherheit etwas hineinkommt, denn beide haben eigentlich inflationäre Komponenten in ihrem Programm. Paul sage ich schon, Trump mit seinen Zöllen natürlich auch sehr inflationär und vielleicht preist man das so ein bisschen mit den anderen Renditen schon etwas ein, zumindest das politische Risiko wird hier schon etwas eingepreist. Wie spät haben wir es denn? Haben noch ein bisschen Zeit. Ist schon was los hier? Nein, da ist immer noch nichts los. Wie gesagt, da schalten wir rechtzeitig um, wenn es soweit ist auf Großbildschirm. Sarah Eisen moderiert das dann für CNBC und alle, wenn es wirklich wichtige Nachrichten gibt, poste ich das dann wie immer in deutscher Sprache in den Chat hinein. Da verpasst ihr nichts. Wie gesagt, auch noch was nochmal erwähnt werden soll, die Discord Trader Community. Ich poste dann gerne auch nochmal in den Chat hinein. Heute nur noch die Rabattaktion. Wer hineinschauen möchte, klickt den Link und nutzt diese Rabattchance. Danach ist erstmal eine Weile Ruhe. Also nur noch heute. Hello Discord. Die Community wurde ja sehr gut aufgegriffen. Aber jetzt gehen wir noch ganz kurz hinein in die Märkte, bevor es zu spät ist. 15 Minuten. Aber ich halte den Bildschirm im Auge. Wir sind ja kurz nochmal im Future drin, im FDAX. Ja, wir mühen uns. Hier im FDAX haben wir ja weiterhin die Spanne letztendlich grob aktiv, 50-Tageslinie, 100-Tage-Linie, heute wieder die 100-Tage-Linie, gestern die Oberseite getestet, wieder abverkauft, haben wir heute schon gesprochen mit den langen dort, schwache Tageskerze, geht vermutlich wieder zur Unterseite, heute zur Unterseite schon verletzt. Aber wie eben schon gesagt, wir laufen Richtung Feiertag, morgen verkürzter Handel, dann der Feiertag. Normalerweise positiv. Also ich kann mir gut vorstellen, dass wir heute wirklich nur was tief sehen und dann nochmal hochziehen und dann den Feiertag patriotisch, Wall Street, da brennt nichts an, dass wir dann wieder fest schließen können. Das kann ich mir sehr, sehr gut vorstellen, dass wir einfach volatil bleiben. Auch nicht das Blow-off-Top hier sehen, ne? Besten 2 Wochen des Jahres, das nicht, aber eben, dass wir volatil uns weiter bewegen. Also DAX hängt ja weiter drin, hat Abwärtsdynamik aufgekommen, fast schon zu viel Abwärtsdynamik. Gehen kurz mal in Stundenchart hinein. Ja, die Bewegung, die wir hier haben, ich hatte es eben auch schon in der Discord-Community geschrieben, ja, vom aktuellen Niveau gut 150 Punkte könnte man mal nach oben laufen. Wenn wir die Bewegung seit gestern sehen, ne? Ja, hier war schon ein bisschen die Frage, ist bloß der Dreivelle, aber es sieht schon sehr nach einem Impuls aus, dass wir doch nochmal hochlaufen und dann doch nochmal die 18.000 holen. Mal sehen. Aber das sieht ein bisschen impulsiv aus, aber eben auch mit der Chance, dass wir hier nochmal eine Erholung sehen. Vielleicht zieht sie sich ja auch weiterhin, ne, Richtung Feiertag passt es ja vielleicht auch zusammen. Also hier, das sieht impulsiv aus, mögliche dritte Welle, aber mit der Chance, dass man sich hier auch nochmal erholen kann. Aber das schauen wir auch gleich nochmal im schauen wir auch gleich nochmal im Tasserhandel an, bei den Kursen, kurz nochmal auch bei Nasdaq hinein. Nasdaq, S&P, hier ist der S&P. Was will man hier sagen? Das ist alles wirklich eine flache Konsolidierung. Hier ist hier ist die Abwärtsbewegung vom April. Danach haben wir einen Impuls gestartet, der aktuell auch nur flach konsolidiert. Also maximal eine ABC ist hier zu erkennen. Im Nasdaq ganz ähnlich. Auch hier haben wir natürlich auch der MACD ein bisschen gekreuzt schon, aber beim Nasdaq auch. Aber wie gesagt, es brennt ja nicht. Wenn man hier jetzt mit der Zwischentiefe mal triggern, am besten hat man ja im bärischen Sinne, ja, tiefer gestelltes Hoch, zweimal eine schwache Tageskerze stehen gelassen, im S&P 500 sogar ein Bearish Engulfing Pattern stehen gelassen, aber das muss man eben auch triggern. Ja, das muss man eben auch triggern und im bärischen Fall triggert man das ja mit dem Gap sogar, dass man so direkt schwächer reinkommt, ne? Morgen schon oder über die Feiertage, was eigentlich ziemlich unwahrscheinlich ist, aber dass wir hier so vielleicht so eine kleine Inselumkehr stehen lassen und dann mal Dynamik auf der Unterseite sehen. Das müssen eigentlich die Bären sehen. Was wir aktuell sehen, ja, wir haben kleine Divergenzen offen, der Markt hat sowieso Warnsignale, mögliches Doppeltop, aber vielleicht eben nicht. Wenn wir nicht triggern, dann macht er eben hier bloß eine Seitwärtskonsolidierung, bastelt der dann und können wir nochmal nach oben angreifen. Also der Zug ist ja definitiv nicht abgefahren. Im US-Markt, im DAX sieht die Sache nicht mehr ganz so frisch aus, im US-Markt aber schon alles erst flache Konsolidierung. Das kann natürlich von heute auf morgen vorbei sein. Ne? Wenn wir, wie gesagt, so ein Abwärtsgap hier mal bekommen, Abwärtsdynamik, haben wir ganz schnell ein anderes Bild, aber das muss man eben erst mal sehen. Bis hierhin ist das alles verdammt flach. Alles sehr, sehr flach. Hält sich das alles noch, bis es eben nicht mehr funktioniert. Also gerade die Gap-Zone wäre hier interessant. Gucken wir Stundenchart noch rein. Ja, im Stundenchart haben wir sogar die Zeichnung von der letzten Woche drin. Ja, eben genau diese ABC-Bewegung, die ich eben schon angedeutet habe im S&P 500, hier im Nasdaq. Also seit dem Hoch hier auch das mögliche Doppeltop, aber das kann eben genauso gut bloß eine bullische Konsolidierung sein. Hier hat das ABC eingezeichnet, nicht ganz so hoch. Das haben wir dann noch weiter ausgedehnt, aber ja, also könnte man hier unten auch noch was holen. Ja, aber darauf wetten, ne? Also hier Short zu gehen im US-Markt, das wäre alles momentan zu früh. Ne? Die Bären bräuchten hier eigentlich Dynamik. Ne? Die bräuchten Abwärtsdynamik, bevor sie hier irgendwie agieren im US-Markt. Im DAX gibt es die Setups. Ne? In der Range bieten die sich an. Da kann man das eher spekulieren auf die Abwärtsbewegung mal. Gestern die Oberkante der Widerstandszone getestet. Hier im US-Markt nicht unbedingt. Wir können ganz kurz noch in die Kassehandel hinein. Wie spät? 20 nach. Wir haben noch 10 Minuten. Hier sind wir ganz kurz auch noch mal im DAX im Quartalchart. Hatte ich ja auch vorgestern gezeigt, weil wir da mit dem hohen Start hier mit den Quartalskerzen, hier Quartalswechsel Q1, Q2 reingelaufen sind. Ja, das ist der Bereich 18,4, 18,5, wo man eigentlich mit Dynamik rüber muss. Wenn wir dort mit Dynamik durchbrechen, dann ist eben auch die Chance für die 19.000 wieder da. Aber wenn nicht, ja, dann kann es gut sein, dass der DAX ja auch ein starker Underperformer ist. Ne? Der US-Markt konsolidiert flach, hat noch mehrere Allzeithochstände geholt und der DAX steht schon ein gutes Stück, ja, fast 1000 Punkte unter seinem Allzeithoch. Und müht sich ab jetzt hier in dieser Widerstandszone, hier im Quartalchart, dem der neuen Quartalskerze, aber auch im Monatschart hatte ich auch schon ausgepackt hier. Ne? Das sind die Monatskerzen, das ist jetzt die neue, Juli, Juni, Mai, April, März. Sind wir immer hier auf dieser Monatswechselbasis hier. Sind wir gestern angekommen? Ne, gestern war der erste, ja, gestern zum der Quartalsauftakt angekommen. Das hatte ich das auch schon in der Discord-Community gepostet. Mal gucken, ob wir hier durchkommen. Ne? Normalerweise findet hier schon ein bisschen Action statt und dann muss man dann erstmal durchbrechen. Wenn man dort durchbricht, ja, gute Chance für die 19.000. Aber wenn nicht. Ja, das ist halt die untere Seite wieder im Fokus. Dann sind wir auch ganz schnell mal wieder bei den April-Tiefs, die oberhalb der 18.000 noch abgesichert sind. Aber ja, so richtig schön sieht eben die Bewegung momentan beim DAX auch nicht aus. Und dann könnte es gut sein, dass wir doch mal durchrutschen, übergeordnet. Ja, seit Corona, Anstiegsbewegung, Cup-and-Handle ausgebildet, Richtung 50er Fibonacci, ist das ja alles vollkommen in Ordnung. Ja, da ist übergeordnet überhaupt nicht angebrannt, auch wenn wir jetzt der Underperformer sind. Was man eher im Hinterkopf behalten sollte, es wäre nicht verwunderlich, wenn der DAX mal den Weg zur Ausbruchzone sucht. Ne? Hier im großen Bild Monatschart hatte ich ja immer wieder ausgepackt. Aber das kommt dann auf die einzelnen Marken an. Ne? So Ausbruchzone mal ein Jahr Richtung Kappenhändler Ausbruchzone und dann Weg frei für, ja, was weiß ich, es geht schon deutlich über die 19.000. Und dann wäre das hier eine Bestätigung. Hier mal runterfallen, mit der Monatskerze dort eine Hammerkerze stehen lassen. Gute Chance, dass wir hier sehr gut weiter ansteigen können und auch die Ziele dieser Cup-and-Handle-Formation dann erreichen. Deutet sich das momentan an, ja, oberhalb der 18.000 sowieso nicht, darunter die April-Tiefs, wenn wir dort Probleme haben, ja, dann ist dieses Szenario auf dem Schirm. Ne? Also jetzt nur, weil ich das so eingezeichnet ist, könnte mal noch passieren. Sieht man ja sehr gerne auf der halben Strecke nach dem Ausbruch, kommt die Rebound-Bewegung, bestätigt man nochmal den Ausbruch, es geht weiter nach oben mit dem nächsten Schub. Ja, da steht etwas an, aber diese Signale haben wir nicht. Ne? Das 18.000, dann April-Tief, dann ist dieses Szenario. Ne? Wir müssen erst diese Zonen durchbrechen. Aber so für den Hinterkopf und einfach, weil ich euch ja auch zeigen wollte, dass wir hier mit dem Bereich 18,4, 18,5 eben auf Monatssicht im Bereich sind, wo wir immer wieder gekämpft haben. Und gestern sind wir dort eben erstmal wieder abgeprallt. Kurz hinein mal, auch hier vielleicht nochmal in den Tagesschau. Ne? Gestern die Tageskerze 50-Tageslinie. Und hier sind wir heute schon ein bisschen auf der Unterseite sogar zurück durchgebrochen. Ja, ein bisschen Stop-Loss-Hunting, jetzt doch wieder stabilisieren. Ich hatte ja auch ein Setup gepostet, gucken wir auch gleich nochmal drauf. Aber letztendlich, die Spanne ist noch da. Ja, sie ist noch nicht weg. Ne? Hier gestern sind wir auch kurz rüber. So ist der Markt. Der trägt nicht exakt an diesen Zonen ab. Aber ich sehe noch die Chance, dass wir in der Tat uns noch stabilisieren können Richtung Feiertage und dann die Spanne weiterhin halten können. Sehen wir jetzt im Cetra-DAX, ja, wir haben auch die 100-Tage-Linie schon verletzt gehabt. Jetzt ziehen wir wieder ein bisschen hoch. Vermutlich hat das Stop-Loss ja natürlich geholt. Ganz knapp, aber es war ein sehr enges Setup innerhalb der Range. Da will man ja auch nichts riskieren. Setup SMA 100, also die 100-Tage-Linie, knapp 18.080 Bereich. Wo haben wir es denn stehen? 18.085. Ja, stehen wir oberhalb, bleibt die Range hier zwischen 50-Tageslinie und 100-Tage-Linie aktiv mit der Zwischenzone um die 280 am mittleren Bonninger Band. Und das ist, wie gesagt, auch wenn wir jetzt hier ein bisschen verletzt sind auf der Unterseite, meine Hauptannahme, dass wir drinnen auf alle Fälle noch bleiben können, auch aufgrund des Feiertags in den USA, der einfach patriotisch grün ist. Jetzt gucken wir kurz auf Setup, wie es eben manchmal läuft. Ganz eng hatte ich das gepostet und ihr seht selbst, wir stehen hier auf Einstand und ja, unten knapp am Stop-Loss gerissen, aber es war Chancen-Risiko-Verhältnis 1:3 und haben wir mehrfach hier drin auch gesetzt. Ne? So lange spielen die Range, bis es eben nicht mehr geht und dann passt das auch mit diesem engen Stop-Loss. Da riskiert man nicht viel. Für alle, die sagen, ja, ein bisschen mehr Luft ist ja vollkommen in Ordnung, man kann das ja auch viel enger setzen. Die sagen, es gibt ja viele Möglichkeiten, ne? Die so sagen würden, ja, ich glaube, wir halten die Tiefststände der letzten Woche oder vom Juni und ziehen dann nach oben durch. Kann man ja so ein Setup genauso setzen. Ne? Dann passt das Chancen-Risiko-Verhältnis auch. Für dieses Setup, was ich heute früh gepostet habe, wo war das bis hierhin, das wäre so meiner Meinung nach nicht mehr gültig. Auf dem wir ja nun auch schon ziemlich, ist der Impuls vom FDAX auch nochmal gut zu erkennen. Also was ich mir von hier, eben vom Tief, hatte ich es gesagt, 150 Punkte kann ich mir da vorstellen. Ich muss gucken, dass das Event nicht verpassen, dass wir dann 150 Punkte hochlaufen können. Das wäre dann eher noch diese. Also für alle, die ja auch noch das Setup am Laufen haben, ja, hochlaufen Richtung 18,2 und dann würde ich, glaube ich, schon absichern. Aber gut, das diskutieren wir dann alles immer in der Discord-Community. Ne? Nutzt die Chance, kommt mit hinein, seid ihr bestens informiert über das Marktgeschehen und verpasst nichts. Ganz kurz vorher hinein in S&P 500, haben wir ja eben schon geschaut im großen Bild. Letztendlich ja brennt eben nicht viel an, hat mir im Future angeschaut. Hier ist es nun auch nicht anders. Hier auch nochmal zu sehen, ein bisschen die Abwärtsbewegung April, dann der Impuls. Die hatten hier 2 bearish engulfing Pattern ausgebildet, ja, müssen aber eben auch getriggert werden, ne? Was so eine bärische Tageskerze ist, nur ein Zeichen, ne, von vielen. Die Kombination macht es am Ende und das Zwischentief, hier haben wir noch nicht mal 5.440 nicht verletzt, immer wieder dort abgedreht, brechen wir dort mal durch. Ja, da haben wir schon das mittlere Bollinger Band an der 5.420. Interessant wäre erst, wenn wir hier wirklich die Gap-Zone mal attackieren und im Idealfall für die Bären mal. Ich weiß, es gibt sehr viele Bären da draußen. Bräuchten die eigentlich im Idealfall wirklich mal Abwärtsdynamik ins Gap hinein. 5.400 Reisen per Abwärtsdynamik, sowas bräuchten sie hier, so eine Inselumkehr stehen lassen und dann mal einen Abgabedruck unter die 5,3. Ja, dann könnte hier was entstehen. Alles hier oben, wie eben schon gezeigt, auch im Nester gezeigt, mögliche ABC. Das ist konsolidieren. Momentan konsolidieren. Das kann von heute auf morgen, das kann von einer zur nächsten Stunde anders sein, wenn wir plötzlich mal so eine riesen Abwärtskerze sehen, weil hier irgendein Trigger reinkommt, dann läuft ein anderes Szenario und dann passen wir uns an. Und wenn ihr das nicht verpassen wollt, schaut ihr einfach mit hinein in die Discord-Community. Wie gesagt, den Link hatte ich ja schon gepostet. Also bei den US-Indizes brennt nicht viel an. Dow Jones können wir vielleicht noch kurz hingucken. Hatten wir auch schon eine Weile nicht mehr drauf geschaut. Ja, letztendlich ist ja auch nicht viel passiert. Genau diese ABC-Bewegung ist immer noch drin. Die hatten wir hier letzte Woche schon eingezeichnet. Und ja, man ist hochgelaufen. Ich glaube, im Future, können wir auch noch mal ganz kurz drauf gucken, da lebt sogar noch ein möglicher Impuls. Ein möglicher Impuls ist hier sogar noch im Future drin. Ja, grundsätzlich die Seitwärtsrange, die wir haben seit Jahresauftakt. Ja, also im Future wäre sogar noch ein denkbarer Impuls drin. Kein starker, aber ja, erst das bloß eine kurze dritte war, dass wir hier die 4 dann doch nochmal hochlaufen können. Das lebt im Future, aber es sieht auch nicht sehr schön aus. Ne? Der Dow Jones, das ist den Bereich, da tradet man die Cluster oder die Ober- und die Unterseite. Ansonsten wartet man ja auch ab. ABC hatte ich eingezeichnet, aber ist für mich auch schon sehr hoch gelaufen, über das 61,8. Und eigentlich die Bären müssen hoffen, dass wir jetzt die Zwischentiefs hier nehmen, beziehungsweise der Bereich der 38.800. Dann glaube ich, dass wir hier wieder runterlaufen können in diese Tiefs der 38.400. Hier oben weiter durchlaufen und ich glaube, die 40.000 ist wieder da. Hängen wir ein bisschen fest und ihr seht ja selbst, dass die Händler auch nicht genau wissen, was sie wollen. Nur seitwärts seit letzter Woche verpasst man nicht wirklich sonderlich viel. Man braucht den Bruch hier auf der Oberseite, dann kann man wieder zur Oberseite schauen und Richtung 40.000 und den Hochpunkten. Ja, also Dow Jones hängt fest, Nasdaq hängt fest, mögliche Chance, dass man hier noch die ABC basteln, vielleicht zum mittleren Bollinger Band, wie eben im Future gezeichnet ist, der Nasdaq Daily. Ja, so mal gucken. Also das Gap-Zone wären 19.400, 19.200. Auch hier ähnliches Bild wie beim S&P 500, dort vielleicht, weil wir irgendeinen Trigger haben in der Nacht, dort durchbrechen, mal mit Dynamik, das wäre erstes bärisches Zeichen. Das, was wir hier alles sehen, das ist alles noch flache Konsolidierung. Auch MACD hier gekreuzt, auch der RSI, haben wir natürlich eine schöne Differenz drin. Ne? Der bestätigt den Allzeithoch hier gar nicht, der RSI. Ne? Bestätigt ja gar nicht, fallend. Warnsignale, Divergenzen haben wir genug, aber wenn das eben nicht getriggert wird, ist das alles recht nebensächlich. Also die US-Märkte sehen noch ziemlich gut aus, um die Sache hier auf den Punkt zu bringen. Da ist noch nichts angebrannt. Wir haben viele, viele Warnsignale, aber nichts angebrannt. Wir brauchen hier Abwärtsdynamik. Jetzt gehen wir hinein zu Lagarde und es geht, ihr seht schon, geht gleich los, zu Lagarde und Fed-Chef Powell. Und ich glaube, der Notenbankpräsident von Brasilien ist auch noch mit dabei. Schauen wir uns gleich an. Moderiert von Sarah Eisen, CNBC. Alle wichtigen Keynotes liefere ich dann hier in den YouTube-Chat. Denkt dran, kommt gerne mit in die Discord-Community, klickt den Link in der Videobeschreibung oder im Chat. Würde mich freuen, euch dort zu sehen. Auch nur noch heute 20% für wenige Cent am Tag bekommt ihr ein Rundum-Paket, Marktgeschehen, technische Analyse, Trading-Signale. Was will man eigentlich mehr? Nun gut, ich bin jetzt still. Wir gehen rüber. Der Livestream müsste jeden Moment starten und schauen wir uns diese Sache einfach mal in Ruhe an. Und wie gesagt, alle Informationen gibt es dann im Chat und morgen sehen wir uns definitiv wieder aus dem Market Briefing. Vielleicht bringe ich auch nochmal einen Chart-Check und rund um die Uhr sehen wir uns in der Discord-Community. Das soll es nun aber gewesen sein. Augen auf, Jerome Powell und Madame Lagarde.
Inflation in the euro area has fallen substantially from its peak. And we at the ECB are absolutely determined to ensure that inflation returns to our target. But like other central banks, we also find ourselves in an era of transformation. Geopolitical shocks, a changing climate are driving this change, upending our old reality and replacing it with new uncertainties. As central bankers, our role will remain the same as before, ensuring price stability. But the world in which we operate is likely to become far more complex. So at the ECB-Forum, in the beginning of July, we will discuss how central banks, including us, the ECB, can best navigate this new terrain. Please join us.
Inflation is now returning to central banks' targets. Many have already cut interest rates. Others are considering doing so. The questions now are how low will rates go and whether the global economy can weather the political risks that we see all around us and avoid a serious recession. Our next panelists are very much better placed than most to provide the answers. This session will be moderated by Sarah Eisen, an anchor at CNBC. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so honored to be back on this stage. We were here a year ago, and it is my also great pleasure to welcome three people who need no introduction in this room. Chair Powell from the Federal Reserve, President Lagarde, our host from the European Central Bank, and President Campos Neto from Brazil. This time last year, when we were all talking, you guys were in the sort of final process of hiking rates. Fast forward 1 year, and now it's interesting. While I'm going to miss Governor Wada and his jokes, we've got three great panelists here going at different speeds, I would say, when it comes to reversing that course. So would love to just open it up, President Lagarde, with you and ask, where are you in this process? Because you cut in June, so now what?
Well, it's been a journey. You can't just say, oh, we cut in June. It's coming on the back of a period of hikes, which was unprecedented, facing shocks that I tried to describe yesterday over dinner, and followed by a period during which we held rates untouched, and during which we were restrictive enough to actually see our medium-term target reach that 2%, which is our objective. And most recently, we have seen in our round of projections, which are really important, September, December, March, and June, we've seen that 2% target with an oscillation of 0.1 about it at the last quarter of 2025. So it's on that basis and on the basis of what I'm happy to describe as the three-leg reaction function and all the underlying data and information that feeds those three legs that we decided to do a 25 basis points cuts. But in the same breath of air, I also said that it was not a linear process, that it was not a predetermined path that we were embarking upon, but a step that would be followed by further review of data, further understanding of where our three legs reaction function would be. So that's pretty much where we are, and I would simply maybe add that we are very advanced in that disinflationary path, and we are in that sort of slow recovery which came about during the first quarter and which we hope will persevere, but all of that is flawed with uncertainties and big question mark about the future.
Sounds like you're setting up the market for a pause now. Is that right?
I'm not setting up anything for anyone. I think that it's for everyone to really look under the skin of the economy and see where it's heading, and appreciating what our reaction function is and how we're likely to decide.
Chair Powell, you have also been on a journey and have been on hold since last July, have not cut rates like the ECB in June. Why not? What are you waiting for?
So let me say that sitting here last year, there was a lot we didn't know, and we didn't know that we were just about to embark on a period of 7 months of much lower inflation readings. We didn't realize that the second half of last year was going to be an extraordinary year from a growth standpoint, and also from the standpoint of the labor market. So things actually worked out in the second half of last year in a remarkable way. Then, as you know, in the first quarter of this year, we continue to have solid growth in the first half, actually, solid growth, and a labor market that's still strong, although we've seen a continued rebalancing in the labor market. And inflation, after pausing in the first quarter, now shows signs of resuming its disinflationary trend. So it's a little bit different journey. So where that leaves us is we've made quite a bit of progress in bringing inflation back down to our target. While the labor market has remained strong and growth has continued, we want that process to continue. I think the last reading and the one before it in inflation, the one before it to a lesser extent, do suggest that we are getting back on a disinflationary path. We want to be more confident that inflation is moving sustainably down toward 2% before we start the process of reducing how tight our policy is, of loosening policy. And that's what we've said, and what we'd like to see is more data like what we've been seeing recently. We'd also like to see the labor market remain strong. We've said that if we saw the labor market unexpectedly weakening, that is also something that could call for a reaction.
How much more confident do you want to be? The PCE number 2.6, that wasn't too bad that we got last week.
That's right. So we're actually on a 12-month basis. We're actually at 2.6, both headline and core for inflation, and that represents really significant progress. I think we peaked at 5.4% in core, and the same thing has happened in headline. We've gone from 7.1 to 2.6. So yes, we've made a lot of progress. We just want to understand that the levels that we're seeing are a true reading on what is actually happening with underlying inflation. And as we were saying at the last part of last year, people were saying, you need to declare victory, this is over. And then we had a quarter of inflation which was well above 3%. So we want to be more confident, and frankly, because the U.S. economy is strong and the labor market is strong, we have the ability to take our time and get this right, and that's what we're planning to do.
So September?
I'm not going to be landing on any specific dates here today. Let me also say that we're well aware that if we go too soon, that we could undo the good work we've done in bringing down inflation, and if we go too late, we could unnecessarily undermine the recession, the recovery, and the expansion, and so we're aware that we have two-sided risks now, more so than we did a year ago. That's a big change. I'd say risks are coming much more into balance now.
President Campos, you have been on a different journey because you've actually been cutting rates for much of the last year and have recently paused. Why? What are you seeing in inflation data, and what are you going to do next?
Okay, so if you go back a little bit in the history of time, so Brazil was one of the first countries to hike rates. I think in part because we had a different call on the dynamics of inflation, both locally and globally, and I think that turned out to be correct. And then at some point in time, we started the easing cycle, and throughout this process of easing, we've seen that inflation has converged. We have some of the problems that are common to advanced economies and other Latin American countries, which is labor markets very strong. So there were 2 points of attention. One was labor market being that strong, would that at some point in time mean inflation in the service side? And even though we haven't seen that yet, what we try to do is to try to estimate what would be the components of labor in every service so that we can anticipate if that were to happen. We haven't seen it, but we think it's, there is somewhat of a correlation when you look at the margin. And so most recently we decided to pause. That had to do not only with the current numbers and with this suspicion that we had service inflation that could peak at some point in time, and also because food prices we're going back up a little bit, and I also think that's not only happening in Brazil, it's going to happen in some other places too. But also has to do with a lot of noises that we had. So we decided to interrupt the cycle. More recently, we've had a sell-off in some of the emerging market countries. Brazil was more affected. But I think this has to do much more with noises that were created than the fundamentals. And the noises are related to two channels. One is the expectation on the path of fiscal policy, and the other one is expectation on the future of monetary policy. So when you had these two at the same time, I think it created uncertainty enough that for us, we needed to interrupt and see how we can fix that channel and how we can communicate better so that we can eliminate those noises. Because there is a big disconnection with the current data, both fiscal and inflation data, and the expectation. So what happened in Brazil is the expectations started to anchor, even though the current data is coming as expected.
Right. So you're talking about the fall in the stock market and the real recently when you talk about the markets.
But for us, what matters is how this gets into our reaction function. So I'm talking about expected inflation, the long end of interest rate curve. So we had somewhat of a steepening of the interest rate curve. We had a devaluation of the currency. But for us, what matters is the expected inflation, both implied inflation from the markets and expected inflation from the surveys. Those have gone up.
Yeah, I mean, President Lagarde, you have described the path to 2% as bumpy. We got an inflation report in the Eurozone this morning, 2.5%, not too bad, but core was high and services are still above 4%. So what is keeping prices so sticky?
Well, first of all, we had, as you said, a number that was lower than last month. So we said it was bumpy, and it's heading in the right direction for the indicator that we use, which is HICP, to measure inflation and to set our target. So that's good, but we still believe that it's likely to be a bumpy road until the end of 2024, but we still have target at the end, in the second half of 2025, on the basis of our projections, and the baseline is unequivocal on that front. You are correct that services hasn't budged. So services is at 4.1, if I remember from the numbers that we got this morning. And obviously we are very attentive to the components and what is behind services. And the real issue is to understand whether those are, this is caused by sort of permanent changes, or whether it is also a factor of the lag effects of other components which are finding their way more slowly and gradually into services. And the jury is out as to exactly what it is. The truth of the matter is that we do have a service number that has gone slightly up in the recent months, and which is now staying at this 4.1 percentage points. Now, obviously, we don't need to have services at 2%, because manufacturing goods are below 2%, and at the end of the day, it's going to be a balance between goods and services, and it depends on the weight of those within the index. But we have to look really what is behind it. And what's behind it is a lot of wages. Services has a very high component of labor. Wages also suffer from the lag impact of the labor system that we have in Europe, where clearly bargaining agreements are negotiated not only on an annual basis in some country, but sometimes on a triennial basis in other countries. So you have this catch-up effect. You know, for those people whose renegotiation took place early this year, they had not had a negotiation of wages in the last 3 years. In the meantime, of course, inflation went up and their real wages went down. So there is an element of catch-up. So we need to really unpack all that to get to the root causes of inflation behind services. So we'll continue to look at that. We need data. It applies to wages. It applies to profits, because we are seeing profit gradually declining compared to the height where they weren't at the end of 22. But we need to see those profits absorbing the wage cost increases to make sure that the second round effect is out of the window and services are also going to be on a declining path as well. But services is the difficult one.
I was just going to pose that Taylor Swift is touring Europe this summer, and there tends to be an inflationary effect in services. Am I right, Chair Powell? We saw it last year, didn't we?
It's not just Taylor Swift, you know, others have come as well. Larry Spring, yeah.
I don't know. I saw her at Wembley, and there was a lot of spending going on. No, but how do you look at the services, the stickiness of the services inflation, and how tied it is to wages, which have been rising?
You know, famously, services inflation is stickier, and famously, it's tied to wages. I would say, so look at the U.S. labor market. We've seen a pretty substantial move toward better balance than we had a couple of years ago when labor was in, you know, extreme shortage. So what you see now is an unemployment rate that's moving back up toward a more sustainable level. You see wage increases moving back down toward a sustainable level of wage increases, inflation, and productivity. And you see, you know, vacancies to unemployment ratio coming back to where it was pre-pandemic, and so many other measures I could mention. So that's what we're seeing. And so the labor market, wage increases are still a bit above where they would wind up in equilibrium, but nonetheless, you can see the labor market is you know, cooling off, appropriately so, and we're watching it very carefully. But it doesn't look like it's heating up or presenting a big problem for inflation going forward. Indeed, it looks like it's doing just what you would want it to do, which is to cool off over time, not quickly, not suddenly, not steeply. It's kind of what we've been hoping to see and have been seeing. So, and you know, services generally they're such a mixed bag, particularly non-housing services are a mixed bag. Some of what you're seeing is catch-up inflation from inflationary pressures that happened earlier. You know, that's true with insurance. It's also true with housing services inflation, where you've got some pent-up rent increases that have to work their way off. It turns out it takes more than 1 year for that to happen. It takes several years. So we see all that in train, and you know, we don't see ourselves getting back to 2% inflation this year or next year, or maybe late next year, but in the year after. The main thing is we're making real progress.
Can you keep cutting President Lagarde if he keeps holding? Does it make it harder?
Well, look, you know, I'm going to give you the conventional response because that's the conventional question you ask me. We do take into account the spillover impact of whatever is decided by other esteemed colleagues. And obviously, my esteemed friend, Chair Powell, is one of those. So we take that into account, but we also determine, you know, our monetary policy on the basis of what we see in our economy, and we look at the data that we get, the impact that multiple factors have on our economies and its numbers.
Does it matter for you, President Campos, what the Fed does next?
Well, I think it matters to an extent, but I think there is one point that is worth mentioning, which is more recently we've seen a sell-off in some of the EM, and especially the EM that had more, there were like more the best cases for investment. And you see that this is being explained with local news. But when you have a lot of sell-offs in different markets and they're all explained by local news, you have to ask yourself if there is a more fundamental factor driving that. And I think there might be. It's difficult to make the case right now, but definitely what we see now is there is more risk premium in a lot of the emerging market countries. And it was very synchronized with the long end of the US curve, and that correlation broke. So we've seen the last couple of weeks that even though the 10-year yield is more or less stable, even actually going a little bit lower, we saw a bit of a sell-off in emerging market countries. And I think that has to do with the fact that as you go for longer with higher rates and much higher debt, you start extracting liquidity from the market, and eventually you are repricing that liquidity. It could just be a temporary adjustment in EM, or it could be the beginning of a more profound movement. We need to wait and see. But I think the correlation between the US Treasury and some of the EM has been broken in the last couple of weeks. And I think we should pay attention to that.
What about the fundamentals in emerging markets? Because the economies seem to do better during this hiking cycle than they have previously. Why do you think that is, and does it continue?
I think most EMs did a better job in terms of, or at least an equal job in terms of anticipating the process and starting the hiking process. Also in the fiscal part, on average, emerging market countries spent more or less 10% of GDP facing the pandemic. Advanced economies spend a little bit more than 20. So I think there is also this thing which didn't happen in the past, which is by and large, emerging markets were able to deal with the pandemic spending less. And actually, when you look at the fiscal post-pandemic, emerging market continues, it's not the case of every country, but continues to do a little bit better. So I think that also change the dynamics. And one of the things is, I think, the independence of the central bank and the maturity that a lot of the central banks have gained in emerging market proved to be very useful during this process of the pandemic.
I mean, all of your economies did better than expected with the interest rate hikes, wouldn't you say, Chair Powell?
Yes, I think particularly, I mean, many forecasters had a recession in 2023, which not only turned out to be wrong in the case of the U.S., we had well in excess of 3% growth. So.
But you still see policy as restrictive?
Yes, we do.
How restrictive?
Well, so that's kind of an empirical question. So I guess I would say, if you look at, we do think policy is restrictive, and we think that's appropriate. I think if you look at the labor market in particular, you're seeing demand for labor gradually come down in the form of job openings, and now a slight softening in unemployment in the form of wages. You see demand coming down, not just the supply that we're getting, but also demand coming down. You also see the effects of high interest rates in the housing market and in some other interest rate sensitive things. So you see that, and I think, I do think that restrictive policy is working hand in hand with this broad supply side recovery we've had, where we've seen the unwinding of the shortages and bottlenecks from the pandemic. We've also seen a recovery in labor force participation among prime age individuals in the U.S., and then some immigration, which has also been a positive supply shock. So we've seen all those things work together to give us, really significant declines in inflation. At the same time, we've got a strong labor market and growth. This was it's a great outcome for the people that we serve, and it's one that we want to do everything we can to foster.
So why not just cut rates to protect it?
It's what I said earlier.
Is it a bigger risk? I'll rephrase. Is it a bigger risk that you cut prematurely and inflation stays sticky, or that you wait too long and the economy loses more momentum?
That is the question, and so our answer to the our answer to the question is we serve a dual mandate, right? And these two things are embodied in that mandate. The risk on the inflation side is that you move too quickly, inflation comes back, and we didn't really solve the problem, and then we have to go back in, and that would be very disruptive to the economy. So the other risk is that we wait too long. We understand that, and the labor market softens too much. Perhaps we lose the expansion. So needless to say, we don't want to do that either. So, but at the same time, so we've got to balance those two. And again, given the strength we see in the U.S. economy, we can approach that question carefully. But as I said earlier, though, you see, a year or so ago, we were talking about inflation, and our framework called for us to focus on the variable, the mandate that is further from its goal. That's not, they've come back much closer into balance. And a good way to see it is the beverage curve analysis that everybody talks about and looks at. We've come straight down the beverage curve, but you're really getting to that place relative to job openings and hiring rates, where traditionally the beverage curve is flattened out, which would mean higher unemployment as a result of further declines in job openings. So you can't know that with precision, but it's very much understood by us that we have two-sided risks and we have to manage them.
What about the recovery in the Eurozone, President Lagarde? It's also been pretty resilient, especially on the unemployment front. How confident do you feel in sticking this soft landing?
Well, we reached a level of confidence back in June when we decided to actually cut rates by 25 basis points. But as I said in the opening remarks, it's not something that is taken for granted, that is a given, and we're going to re-examine each and every step of the way whether that confidence is actually continuously reinforced in order to continue on that path. And it's, I mean, the remarks by Chair Powell made me really reinforce my points about data, because we are navigating in this universe of one risk versus the other, but where data is so important. And data is so important because we proceed always with the burden of the lag of time, whether it's the impact of our policy decisions, whether it's the impact of wages, whether it's the sort of on-time data or not. All of that has to be taken into account and analyzed in details so that we can feel really confident that we can go forward.
At the same time, there are also political risks. Certainly they're front and center. It was nice of all the authorities to make elections all happen this week, certainly in France and in England. President Lagarde, is there anything the ECB can do to shield the rest of the Eurozone from feeling any negative impact from a divided government in France or from whatever the result is of the French election in a negative way?
I thank you so much for your question.
It can't be a surprise.
Because I'm not going to comment on the political situation of any of the member states, particularly those that are facing elections at the moment. But, you know, obviously, the European Central Bank has to do what it has to do. Our mandate is price stability. Price stability is obviously relying on financial stability, and we are attentive to that because this is part of our job, and we will continue to do so.
Does the rise in French bond yields look worrisome at all?
You know, these are the things that we monitor. This is part of the job. It's, you know, it's not particularly at this point in time. We do that all the time, and we are very attentive.
You have fought hard for the central bank's independence in Brazil, and yet now you are the subject of many attacks from President Lula, and so I'm wondering how you're dealing with that.
Attacks from me?
No, no. No, President Campos. Attacks from President Lula. I think he called you an adversary and an enemy.
Yes, well, I think as a central bank, we have to get away from the political arena and try to go on with the technical job. And I think what we did, I think, is a living proof that everything that was done was very technical. So during the elections in which Lula was elected, the incumbent president, in his last year of mandate, we increased rates in a cycle that went from 2% to 13.75%. That's the biggest increase in rates in an election year in the history of any emerging markets. So if that is not a proof that you are independent and you acted autonomously, it's difficult to find another example like that. So I think all this narrative that the central bank has been political, I think we have to get away from that and explain what we're doing. And I think what we're doing has been very technical. The last decision was unanimous, and we now have 4 members in the board that were chosen by the current president. And I think what we need to separate it was what is the political narrative and what is the technical job that we need to do. And I think history will tell and time will tell that the job was done in the best we could do with the data that we had at hand, and that was in the most technical way, and it was done in a group of people that actually analyzed all the data and that worked very judiciously to be able to get to the conclusions that we did.
Chair Powell, do you have any advice for him? You've been through some attacks from
I have no advice. I will say, though, to put it in my words, you know, we've been given this great responsibility and great powers, and really important that we get it right. And we've been told to stay out of politics and just do your job, and that's what we do. We don't try to get involved in issues that are not our issues, and in particular, we're just focused on our goals and getting through that. And if we do that and do it well, I will say in the United States, there's very broad support for an independent Fed in both political parties on both sides of Capitol Hill and everywhere. I don't think that that's really in question, as long as we just are seen to be doing our job and staying on task at all times.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
I think that there are countries where governors do exactly what Chair Powell said, and yet get blamed, criticized, and I think that for some it takes courage to do the job in addition to being a good, excellent technical expert.
But I do wonder if you're concerned, because your term ends, President Campos, at the end of the year, and it doesn't seem like President Lula is going to reappoint you. So do you worry about the independence of the central bank?
So first, I was never up for reappointment, regardless of who won the elections, and I've said that from the very beginning. When I helped design the independence law, I actually tried not to have the reappointment possibility in the law. And for me, the reason was I didn't want that the president of the central bank, at any circumstance, would have any incentives to bend his knee in order to have any kind of re-election. So that we need to make that very clear. Secondly, there is actually a risk premium down in the curve, and I think it has been elevated in the last couple of weeks as to an uncertainty of what happens when the next leadership or the next team takes place. But this in Brazil is done very slowly because the president can change 2 directors every year, and we have 8 directors plus the president. So right now we have 4 directors that were appointed by the current government. And the last monetary decision, was unanimous. So I think what we did in the last decisions proved that the group is very cohesive in trying to find a technical solution for the country. So I understand there is a risk premium and there is always this uncertainty, but I think the group that we have, which is composed of 8 directors plus a governor, voted unanimously, understanding that that was the best for the country at that time. And so I think I understand that there is a risk premium, but I think with time that risk premium will tend to decrease.
There are concerns in the United States about Fed independence if President Trump gets elected. There have been reports that he's looking at that issue. Obviously, you've been subject of attacks before. What is your level of concern about that?
I am not focused on that at all, and that's not just a talking point. I really think that we just keep doing our jobs. I mean, the U.S. economy, we have 4% unemployment. It's growing at 2%. Inflation's at 2.6%. Let's keep that going. Let's do our jobs. History will judge. I think if we can keep things on that path, that's what I'm focused on. That's the only thing I'm focused on. And as I mentioned, I do think support for the Fed's independence is very high, where it really matters on Capitol Hill in both political parties, among the leaders and most of the following. And so I worry about getting the job right. That's what I worry about.
I know you guys don't want to touch politics, but President Lagarde, it does bring into focus the fiscal policies, right? We heard President Campos say it. There are concerns about the deficits in France, if the far right should win. There are concerns in the United States about the deficits. So I do wonder if you have something to say or to warn on the fiscal front as it relates to making your inflation fight harder.
Well, fiscal matters enormously, true, and it matters in 2 different ways from my perspective. It matters from a sort of conjunctural type of way, and thank goodness the European authorities have agreed on the fiscal governance that will take over after the Growth and Stability Pact has been suspended and now completely replaced. So there is a framework within which members of the European Union have to operate, have to control the direction of their debt, have to make sure that it is sustainable going forward through the efforts that they deploy, and have to keep their deficit on watch with enough flexibility, and that's the second part of fiscal spending that I'm concerned about, with sufficient of an impact of a focus on productivity, on growth, of investment that will be conducive to both. And my hope is that in addition to operating within the European fiscal framework, which has been agreed by all European members, in addition to that, countries will actually look at the structural changes that they have to either continue to have in their arsenal of tools, but also that they will continue to improve going forward, because I regard that as critically important for productivity purposes, which we are lagging behind and have been lagging behind for a long time. So we're not so worried about fiscal expectations, as Roberto was saying, for Brazil or emerging market economies, but we're very concerned about the fiscal rules that have to be respected within the European Union, and the structural reforms that will be conducive, hopefully, to productivity improvement going forward, because that's the only way for Europe to actually remain strong and thrive in those changing circumstances and transformations that we have talked about.
And I know you're allergic to fiscal policy, Chair Powell, but I have heard you talk about the unsustainable debt burden of the United States. And even lately, there's been a sell-off in treasuries after increasing odds that President Trump will be reelected, that there might be a sweep of either party. Doesn't that make you nervous when it comes to the progress you've had on inflation if we do see more expansionary fiscal policy, more deficit, bigger deficits, bigger debt loads?
So I'm going to give you the traditional answer to some extent, and that is that we just know fiscal policy is a job for elected people. We're not elected people, so we don't comment on it, and particularly in advance of a presidential election, we're not commenting on anyone's particular policies one way or the other. I will say more broadly, though, the United States is running a very large deficit at a time when we're at full employment, and it just is, the level of debt that we have is not unsustainable. The path that we're on is unsustainable. That's completely non-controversial. I would have thought that this is something that should be a top-level issue, and you do hear this from a lot of elected officials, but it should be a real focus going forward, is how do we get back to a sustainable path, because you can't run these kinds of deficits in really in good economic times for very long. I mean, I wouldn't say, I can't really speak to the time, but in the longer run, we'll have to do something sooner or later, and sooner will be better than later.
President Campos?
Yeah, let's do a basic exercise. If you look at the total debt combined, just sovereign debt of US plus Europe plus Japan, that's 64% of the total global debt. That went, in terms of cost of servicing that debt, it went from 1.1%, 1.2% before the pandemic to around 3.3% right now. But then you added 25% of GDP to that debt, which was the cost of facing the pandemic. So we have a much higher debt and a much, much higher cost of service the debt. So I think there is an aspect globally that is the extraction of liquidity that cumulative will have an effect in the market that sometimes is not pricing correctly. And if you think about what we have to do right now, we have to pay for the cost of the transfer programs that we did. We need to pay for the cost of the green transition, which is somewhat expensive. We need to pay for the cost of the fragmentation, which you look at the surveys and it's very costly for companies and for governments. We need to pay for the cost of the low-income countries that spent very little during the pandemic and now need support. We need to pay for the cost of demographics. And there is a surge in consumption of energy that needs to be paid because of the innovation. So we have a lot of bills to pay. We are at the highest level of debt that we had in a long time. And I think it's sometimes I stop and I think it's time for us globally to think about a way to get to some kind of stable trajectory of the debt in the next couple of years. And it's not one country or the other. It's something that we need to do collectively, because the global debt is very high and is going to start taking a lot of liquidity from the markets. And the ones that will feel the effect are not the advanced economies, are the emerging economies, emerging market economies. And the low-income countries are feeling that effect already.
And you think the market is mispricing this risk?
I think the market was mispricing a little bit the fact that if you have higher rates for longer, the effect from extracting liquidity, depending on how much longer you're going to have these higher rates, I think the risk is higher than what the market is pricing as.
I also wanted to ask you, President Campos, about China, because you have a pretty good view. It's such a big trading partner for you. What's going on there? How much is China's economy slowing?
I'm not sure I'm very equipped to tell you what's happening in China. I can tell you that is very important for a lot of emerging market economies. It's very important for Brazil. We are a very big exporter of food items and iron ore. So China is a very big trade partner with Brazil. And it has been for a while. And regardless of the government, it's important to understand that that is a very important tie to Brazil. The one thing that we look looking from far away is we're trying to see what are the policies that China is doing, what is the focus, and what is the impact that this new policy will have for us. But because we export mainly food items and iron ore, we don't see that as a big threat. I think some other countries will have a different understanding of what this impact will be.
Yeah, I mean, there's also trade barriers that are going up. President Lagarde, tariffs. I mean, in our election, we're talking about potentially more tariffs. Are you seeing that in terms of growth and inflationary impact?
Well, we're not seeing yet more tariffs than what had been decided back, 8 years ago, and which was consistently maintained later on in relation to certain products. So that for the moment is stable. What is not stable at all is the number of protective measures, occasionally non-compliance with WTO rules, the level of disputes that are brought before the WTO, which is not in a position to resolve them because they are not equipped with the dispute resolution mechanism, and magistrates have not been appointed to that effect. We've had more than 3,000 trade protective measures decided in the last 2 years. And that is like 5 times what is the normal average of measures that are decided. So that's a concern. And it's a concern because trade has been fueling growth, and because Europe at large is not a small open economy, it's a large open economy. And trade restrictions are going to affect Europe much more so than other countries that operate without this degree of opening and vulnerability in a way. But the second reason I'm concerned about it is that typically trade is conducive to innovation. Innovation is necessary for productivity. And I think that the combination of reduced trade on growth and the impact of trade on the capacity to innovate and to improve productivity is a vulnerability for Europe, and one that we have to address very forcefully if we want to win this battle of productivity. So and it's not independent from inflation. I'm not getting away from my topic, but it's one that is clearly a concern on the horizon.
But and it could be inflationary. I mean, 10% across the board tariffs, Chair Powell, inflationary?
Of course, I'm not going to be scoring any potential political proposals which have been talked about. It's just not our job to do that. Also, almost anything affects the economy. Trade affects the economy, immigration, energy policy. Those are not our jobs. There are other agencies that do those jobs. We do maximum employment, price stability. So in our political economy, we stay out of that.
Right, but it has implications for price stability, surely, and maximum employment.
Again, we're not looking to be. This is exactly what we're not looking to do, which is to become players on issues like tariffs. I mean, because it affects, literally everything. All these things affect inflation and jobs, but. Notwithstanding that, there are others in the elected government who are responsible for trade policy. We don't comment, that's all.
Understood. So back to your job then. There is this debate and among the Fed and other central bankers about where policy rates are going, R-starred, the neutral rate, what that rate should look like, and whether it's different after COVID. What do you think?
Can we go back to trade?
Yeah, sure. Please.
So, R-star. I guess I would start by saying that the thing that we write down as part of our summary of economic projections, and the thing that economists mean by R-stars, is a longer run concept. It's the rate of interest that would hold the economy at equilibrium at a time when we're at stable prices and maximum employment and there are no shocks hitting the economy. So this is not the economy today. So the first thing to say is that when we're sitting in the boardroom in Washington thinking about whether our policy rate is the appropriate rate for this economy right now, we're not battling over what long-run R-star is, because this is a different economy. This is an economy that's still recovering from the pandemic. And so many forces are pushing it this way and that way, and there's really not a lot of precedent, so it's a very challenging time. But it's not, the question, the R-star question is a really interesting question, and that is, are we going to go back to the very low levels of neutral rates that we had in the recovery of the global financial crisis, or are we going to go part of the way back from today's high rates to that? And intuitively, most people think that we won't go back to those very, very low rates that we saw during the global financial crisis recovery period. But we don't really know. I mean, the neutral rate has moved around, we think, by slow-moving, longer-run forces, demographics, technology, productivity over time, all of those things move it around. Ultimately, the balance between savings and investment. So it's a great conversation to have. But honestly, when we're looking at policy in the boardroom, it's how is our policy affecting today's economy, and do we think we're getting the results that we want? And by and large, in a world where this isn't a world of precision, we think we are. We're getting a gradually cooling economy, a gradually cooling labor market, progress on inflation, 4% unemployment, 2% growth. We're getting kind of what we would want to have. And so that's, I worry that some people, no one in this room, but some people think that the R-star debate is the thing that dictates our assessment of how restrictive policy is. It's really not. Unless you think that the long-run rate is the same as today's rate.
I think that investors are trying to figure out, though, where you're going to end up and what the policy path looks like once you start cutting rates. And it becomes important then.
No, I agree. It does. Yeah. It's what will we discover to be? We'll find it empirically. What will we discover it to be? And I think there's a debate going on. There are people who feel very strongly that it hasn't changed and that it has changed, and ultimately it's unknowable. It does matter for the longer run. It matters for where rates will settle out, but it doesn't matter much for policy decisions today, which are the ones we're actually making.
I guess we want to know if there are like 10 cuts coming or 15 cuts. I mean, do you think, President Campos, it's changed post-COVID? Are you dealing with a different economy?
So the R-star story for emerging market countries is a little bit different. So for example, if you had a table of countries of Latin America, you would find that at least the models internally used by their own central banks, in some cases you had R-star going higher, like Brazil, from 3 to 4.5. But in some cases you actually had R-star going lower. So the question is, what is the short-term view and what is the long-term view, as Chairman Jay described? And I think for us it's more like trying to understand what is the structural reason for the neutral rate in Brazil to be so high, 4.5% real time, is really high. And I think a lot of it has a lot of structural elements from the past, but it has intensified during the pandemic. And you could go and talk about the amount of subsidized credit. You can talk about the trajectory of the debt. You can talk about productivity. For example, when you look at productivity, there is one thing that not a lot of people talk about, which is in the need for raising money, sometimes the adjustment is done on the revenue side. When you do the adjustment on the revenue side, if you look at what's being done in emerging market countries and even in some advanced economies, you tend to go back and tax capital more than labor, because it's very hard to tax labor coming out of a pandemic. If you tax more capital than labor, and this has already been happening for a while now globally and especially in emerging market, then you introduce another element that will bring productivity lower. So when you look at the causes of the neutral rate to be so high structurally, that's, I think, what we need to work on. And Brazil has done a lot of reforms. We have done reforms, and I think if you compare to other EM countries, Brazil was actually able to do reforms in the middle of the pandemic. We did the social security reform, we are doing a tax reform, we did the labor reform, all in the middle of the pandemic. But still, when you look at the efficiency of what was done, the end result seems to be that our structural rate is still our neutral rate, our star is still too high. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to go on and talk about what are the reforms that are needed in the medium term to make sure that we have a structural rate, a neutral rate that is lower than we have right now.
President Lagarde, do you ever see a world where we get back to near zero interest rates absent a crisis?
Do I think we're heading towards that? That's, in my view at this point in time, it's very unlikely, but it's not something that I would want to pass judgment on. What I can tell you is that when we start having that conversation that Chair Powell described perfectly well and that I would completely subscribe to, I would be relieved, because it would mean that we are getting closer to where we need to be. It would mean that we do not have any shock suffered by the economy, nor on the immediate horizon. So that would be good news. But we are certainly not at this stage, and this is not the work that we do when we set our policies going forward.
One thing that's been moving fast and has the potential to impact economies is generative AI. And I know we started talking about it a little bit here on stage last year. It was early, but things have moved, President Lagarde. So how are you thinking about any impact on growth or productivity or inflation of what's happening in technology?
Why, Sarah, that's a subject for which we need another hour, because there's so many questions about it. Number one, there has to be some regulatory framework within which AI and generative AI in particular, especially if it's in the hands of a small oligopoly of companies, is actually organized in order to protect a number of rights and protection of citizens. I would start from that, which is not where we are for the moment, although there are attempts to organize in a better way, as was the case with internet, on a global basis, the use of generative AI. So point number one. Point number two, and I will let Roberto talk to that point because he's more of an expert than I am, the question of how much energy is used in order to test large language models is really something that is not often in discussion, and yet it matters enormously. Third, the impact that AI will have on growth, on inflation, on productivity, I think is yet to be determined. I think most people would agree that it will have an impact throughout the ladder of jobs in most segments of the economy, in areas where mechanical developments have not historically affected jobs in particular, and it will require significant amount of training and constant upskilling of people so that they can adjust to artificial intelligence, use it, and not be victims of it. I would add to that I think we at the ECB are using artificial intelligence, try to do it in a safe environment without being hostage to those companies that would like to have access to the most private of our data. So it does require a cautious management and enough control without preventing the innovation and the creativity that people can apply in the use of these tools.
You use it in models? How do you use it?
We use it in models. We use it in, whenever we need a lot of language mining and whether it's structured or unstructured data for that matter, we use it and we are constantly pushing the frontiers of that. But as I said, cautiously, because we need to protect data and we need to make sure that there is enough human judgment involved in the process of this use of artificial intelligence so that we are not either hostage to the mechanics itself.
Do you think that fears over generative AI, Chair Powell, rendering certain jobs or industries absolute are legit? And is there anything a central bank can do?
I don't think we know. So you see this massive investment boom. You see, serious people in the private sector and the public sector. There's a sense of something big coming here. And it feels like what that will be is it will eliminate some jobs, it will create some new jobs. And the question really is for many people who will it augment their labor and make them more productive, or will it eliminate their job? And I just don't think we know that. It's too early to say. There's not a lot a central bank can do about that. This is really a job for. We can supervise our financial institutions and things like that to make sure that that they understand what they're doing with all different kinds of technology, but also like everybody else, we're meeting with all the experts and asking ourselves what will be the effects on productivity, on inflation, on growth, and will it be enormously displacing, and if so, of whom? One thought is that it'll be more people doing white-collar jobs who are writing press releases and things like that. So we just don't know. It's something we're investing a lot of time and effort. We're not using generative AI. We're very carefully looking at that. other earlier forms of AI are in fairly common use in American business, and I believe we use some of that.
What about you, President Campos? I know you're focused on the energy needs as well.
Well, first, I think when you look at the surveys that we have, and we have plenty now on the use of AI on companies, what you have in terms of empirical evidence up to date is that the companies that use AI to enhance existing labor have had better results than companies that have replaced labor for AI. So that's something that we know. It doesn't mean that some jobs won't be replaced by others, as it was said. But I think what we need to understand is what we are seeing basically is an increase in the ability of processing data and storing data. So it's basically computer power and the ability to store data. And that's very energy consuming. You have a couple of dimensions that you need to look in. You look to privacy, where is the limit, and what is the taxonomy of using this once it becomes a global instrument? What is the taxonomy of using this? Because you could be talking about data centers being placed in countries that have cheap energy to produce services for countries that have more expensive energy. So once you start crossing the frontiers, thinking about how you're going to do this movement globally, I think there's a lot of consequences. And one of which I think is you're going to have very unequal growth between the countries that are more on the edge of producing this technology and the countries that are not, and the energy consumption also be very unequal. So I think globally we need to look at how we're going to connect the dots and create more or less a taxonomy for this development to be sustainable.
In the minutes that we have left, I want to do sort of a quick lightning round of questions. Mainly, we talked about opportunities, we talked about economies. What about the biggest risk facing your economies? And I do wonder if they're the same or different. Chair Powell, what's the biggest risk facing the U.S. economy right now?
Yeah, I mean, I traditionally have said cyber risk to that because we know how to deal with credit risk. We know how to deal with lots of kinds of risk, market dysfunction, things like that. But we haven't really had a big successful cyber attack on a financial market utility or a bank. And that's the kind of thing which I think is, the stuff of lying awake at night. I would also, today though, honestly, really it is just the balance that we talked about, getting the balance on monetary policy right during this critical period. That's really what I think about in the wee hours.
President Lagarde?
Same thing.
Really? Really? Cyber risk?
I think, I'm saying that touching wood, actually, and I wish, yeah. Because it's one, if you ask the financial sector, if you ask banks with which we interact a lot, sometimes much to their chagrin, but eventually to their satisfaction in the long run, I'm sure, because we supervise them carefully. But typically, that's a risk that they flag as one of their top priority risk, and on which I think we need to constantly improve the level of coordination, first, second, third line of defense, and best way to respond to those. Now, clearly, I'm concerned as a person more than as president of the ECB about the backlash that there is against the fight against climate change, and some would argue that it has nothing to do with central banking, but I would contend that this is actually not the case. It does have a ramification impact that we should be mindful about, but it's a risk that is there, and that will come to haunt us if we don't do much about it.
I thought you were going to say geopolitical risk. That's there too, right? Facing Europe?
Geopolitical risks as defined by Maurizio earlier on? No, who was it?
Yeah, Moritz.
We heard a lot about geopolitical risk.
It's there, and it's just on the doorstep of Europe. When you look at this horrible war against Ukraine, it's a major risk which is out there and which is hurting those on the ground and the neighboring countries in particular.
What's your biggest risk?
If you look at what markets price today, they will probably, at least for part of Yemen, especially for Brazil, the conclusion would clearly be that the main risk is fiscal. But I think that comes and goes, and it has to do with growth and productivity and a lot of the things. I think there is one other risk that I see, and it's not very tangible, which is the polarization that we live today. If we think about the amount of time that we spent on some social issues that are connected to polarization and that are not that meaningful to produce well-being of the society, I worry a lot about that.
Yeah. So if we're sitting here on stage in 1 year from now, which we hopefully are, the inflation rate in the US will be?
You know, mid to low twos.
That's kind of, we're mid twos now.
Yeah, well, we have 1 month at 2.6. And, you know, we had a brief visit to the low twos at the end of, but I mean, sustainably, durably underlying inflation between 2 and 2.5 is what I would say. That would be a great outcome.
Headline PCE.
Yeah.
President Lagarde, 1 year from now?
1 year from now, I would say low twos. We are at 2.5 latest reading, and as I said, bumpy on the way ahead, but yeah, low twos.
You've been closer to 4%, President Campos, right, lately? So where do you think you are in a year from now?
Well, I won't be in the central bank a year from now.
We already established that, yeah.
But I think that the work that's being done is very technical. I'm confident that we'll continue to be that way. And I think when you look at expected inflation today, I think it has a disconnect with the current inflation, and it has a disconnect with the fundamentals that we have in Brazil. So I'm confident that the future inflation will be lower than the expected inflation. In other words, I think what the market's pricing today is not in sync with the reality.
What about the unemployment rate? We're going to go full dot plot here.
Yeah. You know, I'd be happy if it were just right where it is now. That would be a good outcome. Plus or minus a couple of tenths would be good.
Is that likely?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable.
Starting to rise.
It's moved up from 3.4. We touched 3.4, so we're up to 4. But 4 is still a very low level. You know, it's been a long time since. The last time we were at 4 or below for this long is, you know, I was a teenager, a long time ago.
Also, unemployment rate in Europe, it's been what, healthy, 6.5%?
Historical low,
yeah.
And I hope it stays there a year from now.
What's the unemployment rate in Brazil?
Well, it's close to 7% now, which is very low when you look at our history. I think probably we'll go up a little bit, but not too much. But I think what we need to look at is the participation rate. So we just published a study that shows that the transfer programs have an impact in the participation rate. Our participation rate was down, and then it's recovering a little bit at the margin. And I think it would be very important to understand what is the dynamics of the participation rate going further.
And finally, Chair Powell, were you a 2-cut dot or a 1-cut dot for 2024?
No comment.
Thank you very much, all of you,
Thank
for
you.
participating. I tried.
So thank you there for such a wide-ranging and fast-paced discussion. And we even managed quite a few jokes, even without Governor Ueda here this year. So well done, guys. You really helped end the first day of Sintra on a high. All that's left to say now is please join us all downstairs where we'll be taking the group photo. Thanks a lot, and please join us again for day 2. Thank you.